Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Chit Chat where I'm joined by Betsy Sewell from Christchurch in New Zealand. Welcome, Betsy. It's lovely to have you on board with us this evening.
Hi, Carla. It's nice to be with you.
So we're going to kick off this evening's Chit Chat by me just informing everybody about your story of how you've come to be in the space that you're working in, Betsy. So Betsy's working career began as a social researcher working on a Pacific atoll. She then trained as a teacher and taught for a few years before beginning her own parenting journey. Her children were immersed in literature as preschoolers, but then struggled with reading and writing at school. Betsy wanted to know why. She followed the research on reading and reading difficulties, and I imagine it would have been somewhat in its infancy at that stage. And after homeschooling her children for a period, she sent them back to school as readers. What a wonderful achievement. Betsy enrolled at Massey University in their postgraduate literacy education program and then began tutoring, mostly older students with years of failure sadly under their belt. The question of why persisted for Betsy. Why exactly is the student not getting this basic concept? What is the thinking that underlies the student's struggle? So Betsy began to create resources for one child and then found them appropriate for the next and the next and the next. Decodable, age-appropriate text did not seem to exist. So Betsy, of course, started writing her own. She left tutoring to focus on producing resources for older students for use in schools. Resources that work in a mixed ability classroom, are age appropriate, and deliver the many hours of practice that we know older students need. The result is now 4, almost 5, and I'm hoping you'll tell us a little bit more about that throughout the course of our chat too, Betsy. Word chain apps, 136 decodable readers, and I'm sure a lot more. Betsy, it's a real honour to be having you join us for this Chit Chat this evening as we talk about older struggling readers. So we're going to kick off with one of the questions that I know we get asked a lot, and I'm quite sure that you will get asked a lot too, Betsy. Is it ever too late for us to support students, young adults, or even older adults to become readers?
Well, the other day I read the story of Mary Walker, and Mary was born in 1848 to slave parents in Alabama. And of course, as a slave child, she was not allowed to learn to read. There was just no opportunity. However, when she was a teenager, slavery was abolished, but she had to do the same jobs. There was still no opportunity to read. And then she had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And then one day, somebody offered to teach her to read. She was 114. 114.
Wow.
And she went to lessons twice a week to learn to read and write and do sums. And 2 years later, she graduated as the oldest learner. So I know we're up to 114 is not a problem. Beyond that, we don't know.
That's an incredible story. Thank you for sharing that, Betsy, because I'm sure for so many people listening, it will give them so much hope. I'm sure.
Well, that 2 years, when you think about it, it's much the same as a 5-year-old. It's quite comparable to a 5-year-old going through the same process and emerging as a reader at 7. So no, it's not too old. I do think she had some advantages though, in that she couldn't read at all. She didn't have all that baggage of inappropriate strategies to deal with. Yeah.
Yes. And I know, Betsy, that when we've been catching up, you've also told me the story of another not so young man that you know of who also has had some difficulty, had great difficulty, but did become a reader older as well.
Yes, yeah, I think you're thinking about, I never knew his name. I met him once and I was really there to help his tutor. I'm going to call him Jason because he needs a name. And he was, I don't know how old he was, 20, 21, I suppose, when I met him. And he had walked out of school when he was 14 because he couldn't read. And the whole, police and drugs and so on and so on. But he decided to turn his life around and came back to this adult education centre to learn to read. And the day I met him, I showed him a sheet of words, and they were really, they were 8 or 9 letters long with a simple prefix like con or pre or x or something, and a simple suffix like ing or er or something like that, and end words and ant words, words like pretending and extended. And he looked at these words and said, no, I can't read that, can't do that. And I just said, just slow down a minute. Do you know this little bit? Do you know this little bit? Do you know this little bit? Can you put all that together? And we did that with, a few of the words. And after about 10 minutes, he slowly, with a few errors, read all those words.
Wow.
30 or 40 of them. And then when he finished, he just looked at it and he just put his head down and he just sobbed. And he said, why did nobody ever tell me that is how you read? He wasn't dyslexic. He'd just never been taught to read. And I don't know what happened next, but it's haunted me. It was, he was a big chap. He was, life had obviously been, he'd learnt to get tough. And toughen up. And I think of all these disconnected young people in schools and what we don't see of what's going on underneath, all that anguish that's going on underneath. Yeah.
I know we were chatting before we came on to the chit chat, and you had this wee saying, Betsy, about, I can't remember if it was a shadow. They carry a shadow of fear, or is that how you describe it?
I say that quite often, even when kids learn to read, that their life has been so much, there's so much shame and fear attached to lack of success and failure, so much hiding it from everybody else, and that fear. It's that emotional stuff is really hard to get past. Yeah.
So we might come back to that, I think, because I think that's a really important point that we potentially hadn't thought we might pick up. But let's see if we can come back to that a little bit later on. So now let's think about, there'll likely be a lot of parents and a lot of classroom teachers who will be listening in to our chit chat this evening, and they might be asking themselves, how would I know if my older student or my older child, in fact, was a struggling reader and speller? So let's have a think about what would parents see and what would classroom teachers see if those older students are struggling? And it sounds really obvious, right? But we want them to be looking at certain things.
They actually, I think the parents and the teachers actually see different things, because children behave differently at home than they do at school. At school, it's all about hiding it. At home, this is a generalization, of course, but at home, this is where parents start to see the anguish and I can't do it, and it's too hard, and what's wrong with me, and all that sort of stuff. Whereas at school, they see the bravado and the avoidance. It's different. Some kids can get quite good. There's a set of skills involved in learning to read. Learning to read is all about matching the way we pronounce words to the way they're spelt. You look at a word like speech and you hear speech, and there it is, speech, and it's making that match, the printed form and the spoken form of speech. And there's it sounds easy, but actually there's a lot of skills that underlie that need to be developed. And they need to be developed to the point where, to be useful in reading, they need to be an instinctive and automatic way of thinking, and almost become an unconscious way of thinking. And kids that all happens on this speech and language side of the brain, all that figuring out words or remembering words. But the kids that haven't got the skills to do that, instead of remembering what words sound like, they finish up remembering what words look like. And some kids can get quite good at it, but it always shows up in their spelling. So that's one thing that the teachers can look for. Also, it's hard going reading like that. So it's very tiring, read a few pages and it's exhausting. Those are the sorts of things that I would expect both parents and teachers to see. Yeah.
That's great. That's great, Betsy.
Yeah.
I've just created this little quote, and it was, matching how we pronounce words to the way it is spelt, the printed form and the spoken form. I think you captured that so beautifully in what you said. And then when you went on to talk about, that this always shows up in their spelling, I think that, like me and my teaching and leadership experience, there'll be a lot of teachers and there'll be a lot of parents who maybe suspect that the spelling component is important, but potentially don't have a really unrelenting sort of conviction to how important it actually is.
Yes, it's a symptom of a whole lot of other things. I think for me the difference is like the difference between dog paddling and swimming. That's the difference. There's the ones that are swimming and it's easy. There's the dog paddlers that can get across the pool, but it's really hard going and it can't be sustained.
And it's slow and it's dangerous, right? To use your context, it's slow and it's dangerous.
Yes. And when children remember what words look like, what they're remembering is the visually distinctive bits, which tends not to be the vowels, which are just sort of little roundy things in the middle. It tends not to be the word endings. But kids can get really good at reading like that. But they, unless they process all those elements of the word, they're not going to be able to spell them. And the other thing that happens when kids are reading like that is it actually takes quite a bit of effort to figure out the words, even if it's unconscious. And that's always at the expense of comprehension. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you. So things that we might look out for with our children or our older students in our classroom are to really pay more attention. And for secondary teachers, they'll be thinking, oh goodness, looking at the spelling. Yes, please look at the spelling. And as you said, Betsy, the poor spelling is a symptom of a whole lot of other things. And now we'll move into potentially unpacking those. But before we go there, let's think about student year levels. And in your experience, when might we most commonly see this struggle appearing?
Well, it quite often starts to break down at about year 4, when pictures start to disappear out of the books, that prop starts to go, and it's all getting a bit longer and tiring. So that's, a lot of people talk about that year 4 problem. I see this somewhere about year 11 and 12, somewhere around about that. Suddenly, students are coming across a lot of words that are not in their oral vocabulary, and they have got no skills to deal with those words. The vocabulary starts to really extend at that point. And how do I figure out this word when it doesn't look like something I know? And I can't guess at it because I don't know it. That I see that happening. And if you start thinking about geography, let's say, and you're reading the capital of this country that starts with V is something or other that starts with C, it doesn't get you very far. I know my son with science, he's actually got a very good scientific brain, but the language at NCA level 1 was just too difficult, just reading those words. Yeah.
So what are the unrelenting diehard habits of those students who struggle? And how could we then rectify those?
The really significant one is that it's simply going about it the wrong way. Just using that, making it a visual process instead of a listening process, remembering what words look like instead of remembering what words sound like. That's the difference. And overriding that, it's one thing to teach the skills, it's another thing to override these bad habits. Now, I've seen a lot of studies, and I'm seeing schools in New Zealand starting to do this as well, where students get a quite intensive course, like, every day for an hour or two a day for maybe a term, just focusing on how to read as good readers do. Just focusing on those skills and building those skills with decodable text and all the rest. And you can make a really big difference doing that, but it's much harder if you're just doing a little bit, 2 or 3 15-minute sessions a week, because there are so many kids. It's so much harder to break those bad habits when they're really forced to go back to that, to read the texts in class. Yeah.
So what you're saying is it is actually really important for those students to have a decent amount of time to develop the skill set and all of those skills, and coupled with that whole decoding, the reading, the encoding, the spelling, all of those
all of those skills, but in a concentrated burst without trying to mix it with other stuff and other ways of reading. I think that's what the research suggests is the answer, and I'm seeing it starting in some schools. I'm quite excited about next year, actually, because there's a few schools that are starting to see that is what needs to happen.
Absolutely. I think we probably both could, and we won't, but we could definitely both name, I'm going to say, secondary schools who actually are doing exactly what you've just said. They have trained up specialist teachers or learning assistants to deliver that really good in-depth concentrated literacy intervention that you were just referring to.
Yes, but it really is much better to be in a concentrated burst, every day, an hour, maybe 2 hours, preferably 2 hours a day for one term, rather than a little bit dragged over several years.
Yes.
Yeah. To change it's about building pathways in the brain.
Absolutely. And you've also got to wonder, Betsy, too, how much more, how sort of more rapid the progress would be in that approach too. It would be a lot more rapid and a lot less taxing on the student in terms of that ongoing time out of class as well.
That's right. Right. And it can be quite exciting, this discovering that I can do this stuff is so empowering. So empowering, and they've got to discover right at the beginning, I can actually do this.
So then in terms of key messages for parents, and I'm going to say secondary school teachers or people who are working in those settings, working in intervention, what should they be assessing? What should they be looking out for? Finding some diagnostic information around, so they know what to be teaching in those potential intervention settings.
Well, there's I actually find just reading pseudo words, made up words, or words that are not familiar, and which, if they're simple words, a word like trying to think of a made up word, plog, say, it should be just as easy to read as slog. It should be, if they're doing it properly. But the struggling kids will go, never seen that, don't know.
And that's and is that because they're relying on that visual component?
They're relying on that visual component, maybe looking at the beginning of the word, or maybe able to figure it out slowly. They've got to be able to figure it out at reading speed.
Because what we know, don't we, Betsy, is that if you and I looked at plog, P-L-O-G, and we would actually unknowingly have that orthographically mapped, it would be committed to our sight word bank.
Absolutely.
Because
it's the same as play, and og is the same as dog. What's the problem? I just don't know what it means. I know, I guess you do too. We both, I read quite a lot, and I'll quite often come across words I've never seen before, and I just read them. And I think, oh, what does that mean? But I know how to pronounce it. And I've read it before. I realise I don't know it.
Yeah. So we want people in those positions to be thinking about using a pseudo word reading assessment. What other assessments would be useful to help them?
I think it's spelling assessment, but not just random words, but a spelling assessment that has different patterns and different vowel combinations and so on. That is I do a decoding test which just looks at the rate children can read real but unfamiliar words. And that tells you a lot. And you can see quite often from just the, you'll start off with easy words and the kids will be, oh, no, I can read that. And then suddenly, when they start to get harder, you see them leaning forward and you see this frown coming. And you know this is taking a lot of concentration. Too much concentration to comprehend at the same time. So,
okay, that's great. So we're saying a pseudo word assessment, a spelling assessment, but making sure that spelling assessment is potentially, I'm going to say, has a scope and sequence. So it has the scope is the content and the sequence is the order. So it's got that sort of from simple to more complex.
That's right.
Range
and
you're
not looking to see whether the child can spell this word, but whether the child can spell the components of this word. Whether they know in a word like flutter, for instance, whether they spell that U with an A, as most struggling kids do, whether they know that ER suffix, whether they actually hear both sounds in that blend, all those sorts of things are the things you're looking for.
So let's move into what are your top tips for classroom teachers and intervention specialists who are supporting these older struggling readers? Betsy?
Start with an assessment. But one of the things we know about older students who are struggling, if a child is, let's say, 12 and reading at an 8-year-old level, catching up 1 year in a year is not good enough.
No.
They're still 4 years behind. Finding out where it's actually breaking down for the student and really focusing on those missing skills. And the other thing is that these older kids, to override those bad strategies, those inappropriate strategies, it actually takes a lot of practice. The evidence suggests it's, somewhere 80 to 100 hours of just practice.
Wow, that's a lot, isn't it?
It's a lot of practice to just build these pathways in a way that overrides the inappropriate ways of thinking.
So then what's really important, I imagine, when we're working with those students, Betsy, is that we are really explicit in our instruction and that there's a lot of instant feedback around when those bad habits are creeping in. So in that supportive environment, they're being sort of nurtured and supported into not using those bad habits, but in fact developing good habits.
And the other thing you have to consider is the whole emotional state of the child. It's really important that the student starts to feel success. and success, and not just a pat on the back and saying you've done well, but they know in here that they've done it, that they're doing stuff that they couldn't do before. I think that is really critical, and that's what engages kids.
Yeah,
that's
well,
what is the commitment.
You know, I think, Betsy, that what I'd really like to kind of put on the table here is around the importance of decodable readers, and particularly your older catch-up readers that are so incredibly well written, and that it's really important that for us as parents and for secondary school teachers to understand that reading is reading, and actually reading is getting words off the page first and foremost, to then be able to go on and comprehend. So whilst we know that a lot of secondary school environments will put an accommodation in place, if we don't stop in our tracks and think, actually, in the secondary school setting, we are also still ultimately responsible for building a literate brain, then there is place for the likes of your decodable texts and the older phonic catch-up readers. They absolutely can be used in secondary school classrooms for different, I'm going to say, English studies, or English teaching.
That's right. Yes, and I've put a lot of emphasis on comprehension and comprehension strategies in it, and I present a lot of follow-up activities that are designed to strengthen comprehension, and even build, as a springboard for inquiry learning.
So what led me to talking about that, Betsy, was when you were talking about that emotional state and the importance of these students experiencing success. And I think that what we could both vouch for is the incredible success that we have seen older struggling readers experience when they have been taught to read using decodable readers.
Absolutely. That young man I talked about at the beginning, who I call Jason, he had every reason to be so upset and so angry, because it didn't actually take much to turn him around. Of course there are students that are truly dyslexic, but not all that many. Most of them just don't know how to read.
Because we're not born to read. We're not born to read. Reading is not a natural process. It is important that we all realize it must be explicitly taught.
That's right. And there are changes. The brain actually changes to accommodate reading. The bit that was originally designed to recognize faces goes somewhere else, and that is the bit that recognizes letters. So all those changes go on in students that learn to read properly. Even at 114, that can happen.
It's outstanding, isn't it? So let's come back to what we were thinking about, our tips for parents and classroom teachers potentially. So I've written these down. I've put number 1, assess first. And we previously talked about those different types of assessment. Then you went on to say, where is the breakdown? And I think one thing that I'd like to add in here, Betsy, is about the importance of us all continuing to build our knowledge about the reading brain. Because that helps us to know where that is the breakdown in the front of the brain with phonological awareness. Is it around the gluing of the sound to symbol in that phonics chip? Is it about the orthographic mapping process and committing words to sight words and in that visual word form area? Or is it in fact comprehension and in that different part of the brain? So I think the more we learn about the reading brain as teachers and parents, the more we're able to be equipped to identify where that breakdown is. And then you went on to say about the importance of unlearning the bad habits. And you mentioned that might take, was it 80 to 100?
80 to 100 hours. There's a lot of, I'm just going on studies I've seen where that change has happened. And that seems to be pretty standard, that 80 to 100 hours. Of course, it's more for some and less for others, but that's a good average.
Yeah, it's a long time.
It's a lot.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
And then we talked about that emotional state, and this is where I kind of come back to that saying that you had about the shadow of fear, you know, and how we know and we see these students carry this, and they carry in the school setting that bravado, and I call it the poker face, you know, making out that everything's all okay when actually it's not. And the importance of experiencing success and really, you know, understanding that decodable texts and the follow-up workbook or activities that go with those really are helpful to enable students to be guided into saying they can do this with explicit teaching.
That's right.
And we teach from simple to complex.
I don't think, you know, decodable texts have to be used properly. You can't just give a decodable text to a child and say, and let them treat it as easy reading. That's not advancing their skills. The skill development has to come first, and then they apply that skill to decodable text because they can.
So for those people who are, there'll be people, Betsy, who may not know, you know, a lot about decodable text that are listening into our chat this evening. So for those who are not so familiar with a decodable text, a decodable, or some people like to call them a controlled text, have a particular what we call graphemes or letter combinations, and the actual words that are chosen. So you should probably be explaining this, not me, because you're the author. But you'll help me if I miss something, won't you? But they are controlled from the perspective that it's not a mishmash of words with a range of spelling patterns in the words. It's more controlled.
That's right. Apparently, somebody counted up, there are 1,120 ways to spell the sounds of English. You know, and to give students all that at once is just a complete nightmare for some students. So you cut it way back to maybe 2025. You know, but G's making get, not J.
Yes.
And write words that contain that, and then add a bit more in, and then add a bit more in, and then add a bit more in, until the students reach the point where they can start, because you can't teach 1,120. They do have to reach the point where they can start figuring it out themselves. You know,
but
looking at a
I
word
think,
and thinking,
and I think that, you know, for us as educators and for teachers, when we learn more and more about how the brain learns to read, then we understand when that self-teach sweet spot hits in, and they can do that process of recoding or phonological recoding, like we talked earlier. If you know log, you know plog, and you know bog, if you know those sounds in isolation. But you know, for some older struggling readers, they won't know the sounds in isolation that go with vowels and consonants, let alone when we put those vowels and consonants together, right?
No, and just teaching them that is not usually enough. The real question is not what they know and don't know in the phonics. The real question is, why don't they? Why has this child been at school for, let's say, 8 years and still doesn't know that U makes the us sound? How does that come about? When they've seen it dozens of times for how many days? Over 8 years? Why don't they know it? That's the question. And the answer usually is they've never looked at it. You know, they're reading visually. They don't look at they don't process the vowels. They don't look at those letters that are not very distinctive.
And further to that, they may sadly be in a classroom where their teacher hasn't yet had the privilege of learning the importance of doing those things. And so therefore might unconsciously be reinforcing bad habits that don't build the reading network in the brain. And you know, it comes down to how we assess and everything, because some children can get very good at reading badly, really good at reading badly, but they do hit a ceiling.
And that ceiling is quite often about that 11-year-old age, where they can't go any further that way.
Betsy, I want to come back to something you said earlier about oral vocabulary, and I want for us just for a little bit to talk about the importance of vocabulary as we particularly kind of go into those secondary school years. And you talked about, with your own son, the importance of when he went into NCEA and needed to build up his vocabulary. So for particularly for teachers who are working with students who are older, struggling readers, can you talk a little bit about how they might go about supporting vocabulary development with those students?
Well, with many words, there's hints in the makeup of the word about what that word means. If you know tractor, say, and can see that little tract bit of it, then you can start to apply that to traction and intractable and so on. You can and those suffixes and prefixes of course have meanings as well. And if you understand all that about words, so that's one thing. But the other thing is that the best way to actually build vocabulary is through reading. And to be able to do that, you actually have to be able to decode that unfamiliar word and see it in the context of a sentence to start to understand what it's about. But so many kids, of course, who haven't got the skill just come to that word and think, I don't know that word, I'll just miss it out. So they miss all that opportunity to build vocabulary. Apparently, to be a literate adult, you need to be able to read and spell something like 35,000 words. And when you start looking at how many days a child is at school, from the time they're 5 until they leave at the end of year 13, that's about 13 or 14 words, new words, every school day. Every school day. And a lot of those words they have to learn the meaning of as well. And they're only going to get it through reading. You can direct teach so much, but not that much.
That's a lot of words.
It's a lot of words. And for you and I, it's probably double that. It's a lot of words.
It is a lot of words.
A lot of them are words that practicality, and I'm just looking at a word there, and specifically words that I could read a whole novel and not come across them.
Yes.
But the words that I need to know. But there'll be words that are in every page. It's huge. It's just huge. And you can direct teach so much, but it's actually in the process of reading and reading properly, as good readers read, that most vocabulary is picked up.
So what I kind of take from that little piece around the vocabulary is the importance of us understanding that, yes, we can explicitly pre-teach so much, but actually you're going to pick up a lot and build your vocabulary through the process of decoding words and making meaning along the way. So then therefore, I think there's 2 really key things I take for that for older struggling readers, Betsy, is that we need to ensure that our students are reading, or our children are reading, and then we need to choose the most appropriate text for them to be able to do that. And actually this is where that term that we're all so familiar with, having used it so forever in years gone past, of reading mileage, is actually still really, really, really important. It's all about appropriate text selection.
Absolutely. And it's just building up that stock of words that you can, you can link what you see to what you hear, and building up that stock and building it up rapidly.
Wow, goodness me,
because
you are
we know
lady.
that if a student is reading, I have to talk about students with older kids, don't I? Keep defaulting to child. But what we do know is that a competent reader, a student that has got all the skills in place, only needs to look at a word somewhere between 1 and 4 times for how to pronounce it, how to spell it, what it looks like, and just be able to recognize it instantly. You know, that's how competent spellers learn to spell, is by just looking at the way that word is made up.
And then they've got it, right?
Yeah.
They can't actually,
got it.
they can't, like we often do this thing where we say to, you know, we write a word down and we'll say, close your eyes and then open your eyes. Don't read the word. Look at the word, but don't read it. But actually it's like an instant reflex that you can't suppress.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
That's what we want to experience.
That's right. And they've done experiments with writing the word red in green in green pen and say, what colour is it? And a competent reader will just, they can't help but say red. Yeah, because the word overrides everything else.
Yeah, it's incredible. Wow, goodness me, so many amazing takeaways, Betsy. Thank you so much for your time. Can you tell us, what does 2022 hold for Betsy and for Agility with Sound, and for what's happening with Word Chain?
Well, Word Chain is, it's a series of, for those who don't know it, it's a series of apps that actually teach kids how to process words as good readers do. Remember last Chit Chat when you were talking to Louisa Moats, she talked about looking at a word as an object and just being able to sort of pull this part and this part and see how it's made up and swap this bit and so on. And that's what Word Chain does.
Yes.
And it links it to the pronunciation of the word. So it's all those basic skills. And at the moment, we've got 4 apps. They're big. You know, they take well over 1,000 words that they have to play with in each app. So it's months for most students to work through it. And I'm furiously trying to finish the 5th one. The first one, you know, the first 4, I suppose, I's either make E or I, and O's either make O or O, and suddenly that's all going out the window, you know. O's make A in money, I's make E in obvious. Lots of sounds, but no SHs. Suddenly it's CI and TI and all that sort of thing. TI like patient and CI like precious. So I'm working on that. And for next year, we will be releasing it as a web-based.
Oh, brilliant.
Web-based. So people, you know, they'll be able to load it onto Chromebooks or to computers and at school or at home or grandma's, anywhere. So that's consumed me really this year. So hopefully next year, I do want to take the using the books as a springboard for writing and inquiry learning to the next stage. And I'm really looking forward to working with schools doing that. I'd really like some time to do some more writing.
Yes, I know you mentioned that we will be caught up.
Written thing for a year, and I really miss it. I
bet you do. Because I know how much you really enjoy that process of writing.
I've got lots of stories kind of floating around my head.
I bet you have.
The chance to write them down is just not appearing.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for taking the time to share all of your pearls of wisdom with us this evening. I think, you know, New Zealand is all that better off for having somebody like yourself who really has dedicated your career and so many years to building up such an incredible resource, which is Agility with Sound, the development of those word chain apps, Betsy, and also, my goodness, all of those incredible decodable readers. So thank you so much for your contribution to the world of evidence-based literacy.
And yours too, Carla. Yours too. Yes, you've done an amazing job to just raise people's awareness of what reading is.
Thank you.
And it's,
So for everybody who's joined us this evening, we thank you so much for taking the time, and we really hope that you have found this evening's Chit Chat with Betsy really informative. If you want to learn a little bit more about Betsy's great work, you can head over to her website, which is Agility with Sound. Are we .com, Betsy, or .co?
.co.nz.
.co.nz. So agilitywithsound.co.nz. And next month, I'm going to be joined by some wonderful teachers and intervention teachers within a school setting who are implementing structured literacy to share a little bit about their journey so far. So enjoy the rest of your evening, everybody. And thanks again, Betsy, for your time this evening.
Thank you.